Welcome, everybody. It's time once again for the next chapter with Charlie Hedges, as he explores turning the page on his life and yours.
Welcome, friends, to the next chapter with Charlie, where we explore thoughts of understanding your deepest self in light of everyday life. My very fascinating guest today is Flavio Souza-Campos. And Flavio writes this in his bio, and I want you to check out the end of it. Well, you won't know the end until I come there. That's a silly statement. Anyway, he writes, I've spent nearly 30 years guiding people through their deepest emotional wounds, heartbreak, betrayal, loneliness, and the ache of love that won't quite land. With over 44,000 hypnotherapy sessions behind me, I've come to believe, now here's what I want you to pay attention to. I've come to believe that most life problems are relational problems, are relationship problems, and that most relationship problems are spiritual problems in disguise. With that, let's find out more. Flavio Souza-Campos, welcome to the show. I can't wait to chat about that right there.
Yeah, that's awesome. Thank you so much, Charlie. It's really an honor for me to be here. Thank you so much, and thank you for the opportunity to, share with your audience. I am a great admirer of your work, and I think you're awesome. So you're a big hero of mine, and I'm really happy to be here. Thank you.
Oh my, I'm honored. Let's just, before I disappoint you, why don't we start the show? So you write, and this is really very, 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 very thoughtful, that most of life, I want to start right into that, and then we're going to get a little bit personal, but I want to start right into this philosophical question, relational question, that most life problems are relationship problems, and most relationship problems are spiritual problems in disguise. Let's start off right there. Talk to me.
Well, we can parse that out, right? There are two statements in there. So when you look at life, not just nowadays, but throughout human history, how many kinds of problems do people really have? Throughout history, you've had provision type problems, right? Lack of resources, lack of food, so financial problems, although money wasn't always around, but provision type problems. We've had health problems throughout the ages. We've always died as a species, as a civilization. Life itself, we always die. So we've dealt with illnesses and so health problems. And then relationship problems. And you can put everything else that we experience in life into one of those three buckets. Now, in some cases, it's a tight squeeze. You might say, wow, there are other categories there. What about my spiritual life? What about my vocation? And there are other categories there. But when it comes to your day-to-day life, we can sort of squeeze just about anything into one of those three buckets. And because our spiritual lives, for instance, it does have a lot to do with relationships, our relationship to the divine, your relationship to the cosmos, your relationship to God, our relationships to one another. It's a spiritual issue, right? So we can roughly say that there are three buckets there. Now, let's look at the other two.
Tell me the three buckets again. Let's remind our audience of the three buckets.
I think it's more, widely accepted that the three main buckets are like, your health issues, your financial issues, and your relationships.
Okay.
Health, wealth, and love, right? So my claim there is that most problems are actually relationship problems. So let's look at the other two. When a person has a financial downturn, let's say, when you talk to, on the surface, they might say, I lost my business. On the surface, they might say, the economy changed. We lost the house or whatever on the surface, right? But when you talk to them at a very deep level, as a hypnotist would, because we go into hypnosis and we talk for hours and hours and hours, not in the same session, but over a few weeks, you realize that yes, there were economic downturns. They may have lost a job, this, that, and the other. But at the root of it all, there's always a relationship problem. I hated my boss was sabotaging my progress. My wife and I were not getting along, so I would get to work late in the morning, that kind of thing. So it's a very difficult causal connection to establish when we have a financial problem. But when you talk to anyone and you talk deep enough, you will see that what weakened us and therefore predisposed us to an economic downturn was really a relationship problem of some type at its origin. And the same thing applies to health problems. I have worked with countless people. For instance, we have this thing in medicine called MUS, medically unexplained symptoms. That's the person who doesn't feel well. They feel like they're sick. They go to the doctor and the doctor says, everything is fine. I cannot find anything wrong with you. But they feel sick, but we can't find anything wrong with them, medically speaking. So they have medically unexplained symptoms. And when you talk to that person at length, in depth, maybe not at the medical office, it's not the proper setting for that. But when they come to the therapy office and we talk in depth, there's always some type of emotional pain related to some type of relationship. This morning, I was at the office talking to a lady whose daughter died. And you can well imagine, if you're listening to us and you're a parent, that's not an easy thing to navigate, but it's sort of a relationship issue. In other words, my daughter was here, she's not here anymore. And that leaves a huge wound in our hearts that may not even be fixable. I don't know, but we have to go to work. I've had the honor of working with many, many people who have lost children, and it's a very deep wound, that we have to tackle and work with. So if a person doesn't address those things carefully, sometimes it does turn into a health problem, but it started off as a relationship problem. So that's what I meant by that statement.
That's great insight. That's and just to add to that, in my theology, I'm working on a book right now the working title is A History of Love. Before the beginning, there was love, and this is a book largely about the impacts of the Trinity and the formation of the Trinity in light of 13th century theologian St. Bonaventure. And St. Bonaventure offers really helpful ideas about love and intimacy and relationship within the divine Trinity. Spirituality, I agree with you so much. Spirituality is relationship. Life is relationship. God is love. God is good. And so that's going to impact family. That's going to impact your finances, your resources, and then obviously your relationships. And that's the whole key. To me, that's our purpose on the planet, is relationships. What do you think?
I totally agree. It's like some people ask me, why do I do what I do? And I ask them, is there something else that we could be doing? Where did I miss the memo here? What else is there to do? It's like
I get a vote.
Yeah. So I think that's really why we're here. I agree with you.
So you deal with this. Your mechanism for dealing with this is hypnotherapy and counseling sessions. And I've interviewed hypnotherapists before, but I must admit, Flavio, I'm unclear. And you have logged more than 44,000 sessions. I can't even conceive. I can't. That's more than I can conceive of. So you are absolutely an expert. Tell us about hypnotherapy. What is it? Why is it valuable? How does it work?
So it's a fantastic question, and it's one that I hear often, and I love the question. But I always start the answer to this question with the following observation. There's a lot about each one of us that we are not aware of. So you and I have met, we have talked a little bit. You might have already picked up on a few quirks of mine that I may not be aware of, right? We observe one another in life, and we see things in others that they don't see in themselves. So you might think of one person as being a little too arrogant, another person as being a bit too shy. But if you ask that guy, hey, John, do you think you're too shy? No, I don't see myself that way. I'm very confident. But you're watching John, I'm making this up, and John is actually a very shy person, as an example. So what I'm saying to you is that we all have blind spots. We all have features to our character and to our lives that we just don't see. So if it's about me, and yet I don't see it, it's equivalent to saying that I am unaware of it. And another word for unaware is unconscious of it. So if we accept that we have blind spots, if we accept that there are things about me that I'm unaware of, and I think everybody I've ever spoken with agrees with that, then we agree that we have an unconscious, because it's just another name for the same thing. I have an unconscious mind. In other words, it's about me, but I'm unaware of it. If I have an unconscious mind, the question is there any way to access it? Which is a different way of saying, is there any way to become conscious of the unconscious? Can that be done? Is that possible? And I think it is. For instance, when you go to sleep and you dream, I think most people would say, well, I had a dream about so-and-so, and I think it's because of this or because of that. We all have this intuitive way of interpreting dreams, whether it's right or wrong or true or false, it doesn't matter. The point is that we have this intuitive idea that there's some kind of meaning there. And what I mean by that is a dream could very well be a tiny little window that opens up between the conscious and the unconscious. So the experience of dreaming has been around ever, as far as we know, forever, because even in the Bible, they talk about dreaming going way back when. So God spoke to people thousands of years ago through dreams in some cases.
Yeah, the whole story of Joseph.
The whole story of Joseph and the Pharaoh having a dream, and a lot of different stories that had to do with dreams. So I think that we can now identify with the idea of dreams. So we understand the idea of the unconscious. We understand that a dream could be one example of a bridge or a connection or a window that opens up between conscious and unconscious. And if that's possible, then what people started asking some 3,000 years ago is it possible to sort of have a dream, in a sense, while awake? Would that be possible? What if we could do that? What if we could create that open window between conscious and unconscious, but without you having to go home and sleep at night? What if we could do that by some maneuvers, by changing the focus of your attention? And as far as we know, there's some papyri that go back some 3,000 years in ancient Egypt, the papyri of Ebers, the papyri of Edwin Smith, that indicate that these people were practicing these altered states of consciousness as far back as some 3,000 years ago, as I indicated. So these experiments have been done. It wasn't always called hypnosis, but the idea of it, right? So you mentioned the story of Joseph and other, when Pharaoh asks Joseph to interpret the dream, he says, well, I can't, but God can. Let me go home and I'll come back with the interpretation. And the Bible says that he prayed about it, but it's also possible that he received some type of message there, right? Because he came back the next day with the dream's interpretation. So this idea of receiving messages from the other side has been around forever. People just started investigating that. Under what conditions are we more likely to open the door? And gradually, the idea of hypnosis emerged. I think in modern times, the very first inroad into this idea came in the person of Mesmer, Anton Mesmer. Mesmer was a physician, and I say this to students because sometimes we think that anything that happened before 25 minutes ago is garbage. It's ancient. It's no good, right? It's all wrong. But I want to say that Mesmer went to the University of Vienna. He was a medical doctor that went to the University of Vienna. That would be like a guy today graduating from Harvard or something like that. Okay. It's not, not everybody got to go to Vienna at that time. in Mesmer's days, and not everybody was a medical doctor. It wasn't like, in other words, this was a highly prestigious position at that time in our history. We're talking 18th century. So Mesmer had a dual background, right? So he was a scientific man, he was a medical doctor, but he had a teacher, a priest, no less, Father Hell. And I've always, I think that God has such a sense of humor. This man was a Catholic priest, but his name was Father Hell, Hell, which I think is fascinating.
Really?
Yeah, for real. You can look it up on Google. Yeah, Father Hell. And he was the director of the astronomical observatory in Vienna at that time. In other words, this guy was...
What era are we talking about?
18th century.
18th century, okay.
Yeah, Anton Mesmer. So again, this guy was the director of an astronomical observatory. Again, heavyweights. These are not fool people. These are people of great credentials. You don't get to be the director of a major observatory if you're a fool. And while this guy started teaching Mesmer the effect of things like the moon on health. Now, we're talking 18th century. You cannot compare medicine of the 18th century with medicine today. We didn't have antibiotics. At that time, we didn't even have the stethoscope. The most basic tool a physician can have is the stethoscope. It did not exist. That wasn't until the 1840s. René Laennec, a French physician, that came way later. So there were no tools for the physician to work with at that time. So, if you tell me that the moon affects your health, might as well investigate that. And since Father Hell was an astronomer, in addition to a priest, they started investigating the effects of the stars and the positions of the planets and all of this. And quite quickly, they transitioned into this idea of magnetism. Now, people think, magnetism, what's it be? Well, this was the time of Faraday, and, the world was teeming with new discoveries in science and engineering and physics, and they were discovering electricity and magnetism, and this was that time. In other words, magnetism is like talking about artificial intelligence today. Everybody was talking about magnetism because it's this new kid on the block. And what they started doing is investigating the effect that magnetic fields have on health. Today, we know that to be a huge issue. For instance, when people come to the office and they tell me they had an MRI, I always smile a little because an MRI, magnetic resonance imaging, is nothing more than going inside of a tube and they apply a huge magnetic field so intense, in fact, that it spins the hydrogen atoms around. And when you release the magnetic field, the way those atoms spin back creates a signature that can be read by a sensor, and we can assemble that into an image. But hey, it's the effect of magnets on the body, right? We can actually see inside of the body with strong magnets. And Mesmer was doing these experiments way back when. He eventually developed this idea of animal magnetism. And that was the effect that his body had on the body of his patients. And he demonstrated beyond any doubt that he could cure people with this new science, let's call it that at the time, right? So a lot of things happened. There was a commission that was appointed to investigate animal magnetism. Lavoisier was part of that commission. So was Benjamin Franklin. It was a big deal at the time. And these guys eventually concluded that animal magnetism could not be observed and therefore is probably not real, because if you cannot observe it, it's not
real.
Which is a very interesting thing, because you can see there the birth of this new movement that we call science, which was a new thing back then. Remember that the epistemic models of the time, by that I mean the systems of knowledge that prevailed at that time was the ecclesiastic model of knowledge. In other words, knowledge is what an ecclesiastic authority decrees to be true. The truth is what somebody else tells you is true. And that's how the world worked for thousands of years. Science kind of did away with that and said, wait a second, no matter what you tell me, let's do an experiment and test that out. So Mesmer started doing experiments, and the commission started experimenting with experiments of Dr. Mesmer, and they couldn't replicate some of the results, something that happens in science all the time. And eventually there was a fiasco. There was a pamphlet war, as they call it, people writing pamphlets, which would be equivalent to social media today, but they would write all these pamphlets by hand and post them in wars.
Social media and pamphlet, I had never heard them compared. That's true.
It was a social media at the time, because that's what they had. So anyway, students of Mesmer, though, started observing that something was indeed happening there. And several things happened during those seances, as they call them. One branch that developed from that is the French physician Allan Kardec, who developed something called Spiritism. And that branch came from mesmerism because they noticed that when a person was influenced by animal magnetism, they went into this trance. Some people, not everybody, became someone else during the trance. In other words, here I am, Flavio, talking to you. Suddenly I start screaming, saying that my name is John, whatever. In other words, I become somebody else type of thing, right?
Yeah.
They started studying that phenomenon, and they kept saying, dude, this is more than coincidence. These people are becoming somebody else. And they came up with the idea that spirits were speaking through that person. This idea of possession, which is all over the Bible. I mean, Jesus talks about removing demons from people.
Oh my goodness, yes.
Yeah. So anyway, they started investigating that, and that led to what today we call spiritism. Not spiritualism, spiritism, which is the idea of connecting with people who have moved on to the other world, right? That's one branch that took off from Mesmer's seances. But the other branch went through a Scottish surgeon called James Braid. And James Braid realized that we don't need animal magnetism. We don't need any of that. We can just talk to the person a certain way, and they'll go into a very light level of sleep. We would call today like a relaxation state. And in that state, you can actually talk to them and they can work out their own problems. So the Marquis de Puységur was one of his students who developed those therapeutic modalities back in the 19th century. And that's the birth of hypnotherapy as we know it today. So all these guys really did is they took this observation that we started off with. We have an unconscious, and we have natural access to the unconscious when we're distracted, when we're dreaming. Now the question is, can we operate some maneuvers here that would give us access to your unconscious, and could we use that for therapeutic purposes? They started investigating this in modern times in the 19th century, before psychology as we know it was born, and they were getting massive results. All of this is published. So just to finish this, there was a physician by the name of, Elsdale, James Elsdale, who worked in India. He worked for the East Indian Company in India. And, those big companies, they would send physicians over because they had people working there in India. So they would send doctors over there. Now, this was before chemical anesthesia. This guy was working in India back in the 1840s. And the very first chemical anesthesia as we know it was developed at Harvard Medical School in 1846. So this happened before chemical anesthesia was available. So Elsdale did over 5,000 surgeries in India with nothing more than hypnosis as a means of inducing anesthesia. This is all documented in medical journals. Granted, surgery back then is a little different from surgery today. These guys were not doing heart valve replacements. They were not doing ileostomies. It was, the word surgery back then was a little bit different. They were not doing as deep of a surgery as we do today. And they were able to do this with hypnosis routinely, and people survived. And this was also before antibiotics were available. So not only were they able to deal with the pain and shock, but also they were able to deal with post-surgical infections without antibiotics.
Got it. So what I'm catching from here, and I hate to summarize that brilliant statement in a couple of sentences, but one thing that I'm catching is that we, because of the entertainment value of hypnosis, the Penn and Tellers and all of these sort of, they're not hypnotists, but that we have this idea. I have this idea that hypnosis is suggestive, that it suggests behaviors that you can do that may or may not fit with your character. But what you're saying is it's more of not a suggestion opportunity, it's a discovery. That through hypnosis, you can discover your inner self, your spiritism, how you are impacted by forces that we don't quite understand in the natural world. Did I catch that right? Not so much suggestion as discovering.
Very good question and very perceptive question. So it's a two-way communication, right? What most people are familiar with is what we call suggestive hypnosis or direct suggestion hypnosis, as you correctly pointed out.
Oh, I just made that word up. I didn't know that was...
But that's the word that appears in the book, and that's when you hypnotize somebody and tell them from today on you're going to eat less, whatever, right? The person wants to lose weight, as an example. Direct suggestion. But there's also something that we sometimes call analytical hypnosis or regression to cause hypnosis, in which you interpolate the person. In other words, let's go to the beginning of this problem. And the person tells you, okay, I'm riding my horse. Well, you don't ride a horse in this lifetime, so maybe that's a past life. That's where the idea of past life crosses into or inserts itself into this field, which is inevitably something that every hypnotist is going to encounter if they do enough sessions, regardless of your beliefs and regardless of whether or not you're looking for them, they emerge naturally. So, and that's a separate topic, but we can get into this if you want. But the point I'm making is that that's a whole different type of hypnosis in which the person is actually speaking material that was in his or her unconscious mind. Now, most hypnotists don't ever get there, for various reasons. And I've certified over 3,000 hypnotists, and we can discuss, how the process of forming a professional is and why there are gaps in the education of new professionals and why it's so difficult for most people to get there. But I want to address the issue of entertainment hypnosis, which is in fact something that exists. And look, there is an anesthetic, there's a common anesthetic, called nitrous oxide, right? So maybe some of you have been to the dentist and they gave you a little mask to breathe you relaxed. Okay. Nitrous oxide is also called laughing gas. So why is it called laughing gas? Because what it does is it decreases your inhibitions and you find everything funny. So they call it laughing gas because people use that for entertainment. And what am I saying to you? What I'm saying is that this is a medical tool. People use this for anesthesia. Depending on the concentration, you can put a person in a relaxed state or you can put them to sleep completely. But the point is that it's a medical tool. It's a medicine. It's a powerful drug that can be used to induce anesthesia, right? And yet, the very same medication, the very same medical tool can be used for entertainment purposes, and people use it in parties to laugh. So the point I'm making here is that anything in life can be used for a multitude of purposes. You can use your car to drive across town and go save somebody's life, or you can use your car as a weapon and drive into a building and hurt some other people. Everything in life can be used for a multitude of purposes. So can hypnosis. So the phenomenon of hypnosis is real, and that's the access to the unconscious. What some people have noticed is, well, if we can do that, what if I do this instead and make people laugh? And it's something that it is real. It can happen. And I don't do that. I personally don't find it funny because I've done way too many hypnotherapy sessions to find that to be funny. I don't find it entertaining. It would be like a surgeon using a scalpel to cut people for entertainment. I don't think a true surgeon would find that funny. You know what I'm saying? So maybe a sadistic person, a psychopath would find it funny. I wouldn't, and I don't think a surgeon would. But the phenomenon exists. The phenomenon is the same, but that particular person is giving it a different slant or a different use, and they're getting laughter out of the public, through hypnotic means.
So how do you make a distinction if I'm using hypnosis to understand my unconscious, my deepest inner self, my self that is much of it is unknown to me. How do you make a distinction between hypnotherapy and the therapy that I have been a part of for 30 years, which we are no longer in the discovery mode as much as my therapist that I've had for, oh my goodness, I don't know, a couple decades at least. I go monthly. I don't go, but I go monthly. I go my monthly checkups to EHAB. And he is as much coach as he is therapist. So we're not always just exploring, what are your hurts you bring forth? He knows, we know me. We've come to where we understand me. Now, how does that impact the world? And so he coaches me through processes, but we have discovered, obvious issues that have become, my issues are, as everyone on the show knows, it are rejection and abandonment. And I work through that. But he now coaches me. How do I advance my life? How do I move forward? How do you use hypnotherapy in that kind of process? Or do you believe in a process of a therapist being a coach as well? Or do you think they're two totally different disciplines?
Yeah, it's a great question. One of my books is called Results, and the subtitle of the book,
there's a link to it on the show notes for people to go to that.
Yeah, it's an interesting conversation because it's this idea that the difference between conventional therapy, as I call it in the book, coaching, and hypnotherapy, and that's the heart of your question. And I think it's a great question. So let's see if we can tackle this. And I'm going to start off with an example, if that's okay with you. Suppose a person is an alcoholic. This is just an example. Person comes over to see you and they say, look, I'm an alcoholic and I want to quit drinking. So we can do conventional therapy and teach this person behaviors that will make it less likely for him to drink. So we say, okay, get rid of all your friends, throw away all the bottles you have at home, and we can continue discussing this and why do you believe you drink and what happened to your daddy, what was your mom like, and we can have those conversations, and it's going to take years, as most people know, and the person might not drink anymore. But if you ask that person, typically, how they feel, they say, dude, I'm dying to have a drink, but I haven't drunk. I don't want to disappoint my therapist. And there's a point to this example. Through a great deal of effort and willpower, we can change behaviors, but not the desire. So character hasn't changed. Desires have not changed. I have worked with people almost 30 years now who have been engaged in all kinds of habits and behaviors, who have done therapy, and they tell me, I no longer do it, but I'm going crazy because I feel like doing it. I just don't do it. Whatever it is, whether it's drinking or anything else, fill in the blank. And that feels to them like torture. The most dramatic example of that are the people who have had bariatric surgery to lose weight. They come to see me crying, saying, dude, the surgery I really needed. Bariatric surgery is when they cut the stomach to eat less to lose weight, right?
Yeah, they shrink the stomach.
To shrink the stomach. So what they tell me is, dude, the surgery I needed was in my head, not in my belly. But nobody told me that before. So now they've had the surgery. It's been 2 years. They went through all kinds of issues because of the surgery, and they still feel like eating. And a lot of them gain weight all over again because you keep on eating.
I know.
So the point I'm making is, okay, so then why does that happen? The reason why that happens is because in a conventional conversation, no matter what techniques we use, we're still dealing with the part of the mind that is rational, that is cognitive, that is conscience, right? My thoughts, who I think I am, what I think. In other words, my rational mind. But we're not addressing the unconscious. Every now and then, in conventional therapy, the unconscious sends us a little signal, and we might say, oh, suddenly I feel sad, but we don't know why. Oh, don't feel sad, it's okay. I do therapy as well, it's interesting. And if I shed a tear, my therapist will say, "Oh, it's okay. You don't have to cry." In other words, she's so afraid of emotions. If I'm in my
that's a bad therapist, bro.
Right, because there's such fear there of the unconscious. They're only trained to deal with the rational mind. So anything that hints at the unconscious, we have to suppress. So most people listening to me might think that I'm exaggerating a little, but not really. When you look statistically at the results that people actually get in conventional therapy and the amount of time that they spend in therapy, and I did a ton of research on this when I wrote the book Results. And as an example, in the case of marital counseling, 70% of the couples who go into conventional marital counseling end up divorced. And people say to me, of course, but you're dealing with a population that is already stressed. In other words, they are already in counseling. And I get that. But in other kinds of modalities, we don't see that because we address the root of the issue. So the thing with conventional therapy, and I love it, but the thing with conventional therapy is that very quickly it turns into socialization, coaching. It turns into everything else other than therapy. And so you very quickly arrive at something that we call diminishing returns. When we actually measure results in talk therapy, the results are dismal. The point is that we like the therapist and it's okay and I'm getting some value out of it, whatever. So we put up with that and insurance pays for it, whatever. Now, so we kind of put up with that. But if we actually do a study on the results, they're absolutely dismal, not said by me, said by experts. And then you say, okay, but you're saying this. I think a valid criticism would be to tell me that I'm saying this because I'm a hypnotist. And so then let's look at the data for hypnotism. And the data is not that good either. And I think the primary reason why the data is not that good is because anyone listening to us right now can call himself a hypnotist right now. You don't need anything. None of the 50 states have a board of hypnotherapy as we do for psychology. So for you to be a clinical psychologist, you're going to have to go to school for about 8 years, take a bunch of tests. So there's a huge investment there to become a psychologist, right? But for hypnotherapy, you can take a class or not. It's up to you. But you can actually call yourself a hypnotherapist today if you choose to. I'm not recommending that. I think you're going to be disappointed with the results you don't get. But
with the results you don't get, that's good.
because there's a lot of learning there. But I'm not discouraging you from trying. What I'm saying is that there's no legal requirements to calling yourself a hypnotherapist. There's no board of hypnotherapy. Therefore, anybody is a hypnotherapist if they want to be. What does that mean? It means that the average hypnotherapist, and let me tell you, I have great heroes in this business, people who are, they might as well, they're awesome. They're great hypnotists. Absolutely fantastic. And, some of my teachers are, dude, these guys are like beyond human. They're so good, right? True, they exist. But on the average, when you do statistical analysis, because anybody can be a hypnotist, the results are not that much better. But if you select only the top of the profession, the guys who actually spent at least 10 years learning, because it takes about 10 years, 10,000 sessions to really learn what you're doing. When you look at those people, the results they get are through the roof.
Well, let's. You know what I'm going to do? Let's, because we've been talking really well about the philosophy behind it and the ideas there. You are very practical in every day down to everyday terms in your hypnotherapy and in your practice, and you have written 8 books. One of which is a novel that I don't know if we'll have time to discuss, but that's quite interesting. 7 nonfiction, 1 fiction. And you've written very thoughtfully about love and heartbreak. And in fact, you write that regarding relationship issues, you help clients understand how we so commonly repeat patterns regarding love relationships the kind of which deals with the kind of people we choose, the habits we exercise with them, and you do that through your hypnotherapy. But I want to talk about the issues. Talk to me about the relational issues that you work with clients. I know you've written a lot about singles as well, and about love and heartbreak, and talk to me about those. How do you what is that about?
So a woman came to see me, and her name was Marta. She comes to see me and she says, I had been divorced for 14 years. The year was 1997. And she says, I've been divorced for 14 years. Marta was an attractive woman. She made a good living. She drove a brand new car. She dressed extremely well. She was well-spoken. And she was in a job in which there was public prominence. What I mean is she wasn't stashed away at a basement somewhere. Okay. People saw her. And she told me, in 14 years, not a single man has asked me, not even for a cup of coffee. This became a topic that I've discussed over the years, not even a cup of coffee, right? So she says, how can it be that in 14 years, not a cup of coffee? In other words, something is wrong. Something is happening here. So we work, we discuss a little bit, how's her life, how's the divorce, what happened to your ex-husband, whatever that kind, do you have children? That kind of conversation to get to know her a little bit. We call that the pre-induction because really we're not getting much done in that case other than getting to know her and looking for an angle through which I can get into her subconscious mind. We call that part of it the induction. So everything that happens before the induction, we have a very technical name for it. We call it the pre-induction, right? So we're basically having a conversation for me to understand how she thinks a little bit, and also to have an opportunity to explain to her how we're going to fix this problem. So eventually, and this does not happen in one session, this happened across many sessions, but I'm telling you the story as though it's one story, right? So eventually she goes into hypnosis. At first, it's like a relaxing state and she begins to sleep better. She's doing better. I think the whole thing was 7 or 8 sessions. I don't remember exactly how many, but certainly less than 10. And eventually...
That's not a lot of sessions.
Right. Eventually she gets into a session where she sees herself as a young girl and something happens between her and her mother. And her mother... And people often ask me, why won't you tell us what her mother said? Because I don't want to put ideas in people's heads and for you to think that the same thing may have happened to you in case you don't have a boyfriend. In other words, this is what happened to Marta, but her mother, in a moment of anger and frustration, as all of us have been angry and frustrated at one time or another, inadvertently spoke a few words upon Marta as a little girl that kind of stuck to her unconscious mind. And Marta grew, we forget, rationally, we forget. And even if she could have remembered that day as an adult, even if she could have remembered, she would have remembered it as, oh yeah, my mom did this. Oh yeah, but my mom was upset. There was no emotional impact to a conventional memory. But when you're in hypnosis, you're not just remembering it, you're living that with the opportunity.
Oh my.
With the opportunity, that's the deal, with the opportunity to retrieve and remove the emotional charge that those words left within her. It's like the imprint, it's like a tattoo in her mind, not the brain, but the mind. It's almost like a tattooed idea in there.
Yes.
It's like an imprint, right? So if you're very young, if you're 4, 5, 6 years of age and your daddy tells you X, Y, or Z, negative things or positive things, even if you forget those words consciously, they stay with you. They do. And that's what happened.
Oh, man, you're singing to me. You're singing to me because I know this song. And this is not a pleasant song, but I know this song. And it is so, what's so curious, Flavio, is that it can be something, we typically talk about when we have parental influence on our relationships and on our relational identities as something habitual. This was happening over and over. But, it could be one statement, one time, but that statement triggered something within me or triggers something within the individual that is profound, yet can still remain hidden. But it only has to happen once. That's the thing that's shocking about it. But like you said, this woman had an experience where something was told to her and it impacted her for forever. And it took hypnotherapy for her to even understand what that was. Now,
the end of the story is really pretty, if you don't mind me telling you.
Yeah, I want to hear the end of this story. Definitely do.
So we have what's called the catharsis, right? I mean, we have to remove that emotional charge. There are tears involved and all this stuff. But anyway, that energy represented by those words spoken by her mother at an age when she was vulnerable, because that's another thing. It depends on who said it, how much authority the person had over you. And it also depends on your age and your state of mind, because if you're an adult today and somebody tells you something negative, you say, okay, this guy's upset, whatever. You don't pay attention to that. But if you're 3 years old and is a person of authority saying that to you, the effect of the very same words is completely different, right? I think everybody can understand that. So she goes through this catharsis. She releases all this emotion. She leaves the office that day a new person. You can tell the face changes. You can tell the person relaxes for the first time, right? So she leaves the office, and I find out what happens when she comes back a few days later. And she tells me, look, when I left here, she tells me I stopped there's a Shell gas station close to the office, on 87th and Coraway, if anybody's from Miami. That station is no longer there, but it used to be there years ago. She stops there to put gasoline in her car. And the guy pumping gas into his car next to her comes over to talk to her. Now, this is a woman who told me that in 14 years, not even a cup of coffee. So, it's kind of... The coincidence is significance here, because we could say it's a coincidence, but dude, the very same day, this guy comes talk to her. They trade emails. Back then, they people traded email. When I was younger, it was like, give me your phone number, right? But apparently, at that time in the 90s, you would trade emails, and they traded emails, and they started talking over email for a while. And for as long as I saw Martha, which was a couple more weeks, they were dating. They were in a committed relationship, and things were going well for her. I didn't see her after that because she solved the problem that she came to see me for. But when that happened,
I'm going to need more information. What did she solve? Was it just in her presence that she embodied this very different attitude or very different sort of being, and she projected that?
Yeah, imagine, to give you an example, imagine that somebody says to a person, you're not good, you're always going to be alone because you're no good. Suppose somebody says that, right, to an adult. An adult looks at me and says, dude, you're crazy, get out of here. And nothing happens. Look at the words. You're no good, you'll always be alone. You say, that's your opinion, I'm okay, I'm fine. No big deal. But if that same person is 3 years of age and the words were spoken by somebody of authority in an emotional state in which your mind is open and receptive, those words become your truth.
Become your truth.
And that is a hypnotic state by definition. So when people criticize hypnosis, I wrote a paper years ago and I say, we don't hypnotize anybody, we de-hypnotize somebody. Everybody I see came in to see me to remove the effect of prior hypnosis, such as Martha in this case. She was in a hypnotic state when she accepted the suggestion that she would always be alone, and that's exactly what happened. She terminated her first marriage and never met another man until she did. Now, if we're only Martha, we could say, okay, this is a coincidence, one-off, anecdotal evidence. But since then, I figured we might be on to something. And I started talking to people about this, and people started coming over to see me who were chronically single. And I wrote a book called How to Find Your Person.
Chronically Single. What was your book's title?
How to Find Your Person. It's on Amazon. And I talk about the chronic.
I'm going to put it in the show notes.
Yeah. And I outline in the book the very same thing that I do at the office, how to solve this problem. We have to get to the root of these things. And, Charlie, it's interesting how life conducts us. People started asking me to marry them because they were like finding partners and becoming happy, So I've always had a liking for that, but I became a pastor back in 2017, and started marrying people as a hobby. It's not part of my job, but I love that so much when people become happy, they find their person, they want to be married, and I find that absolutely lovely. And it came about completely spontaneously. I wasn't looking for any of this. It just kind of happened, and I learned along the way. And the same thing for the other types of problems. The other two kinds of problems, we can get into it if you want, are marital strife, right? When couples are not getting along, how I learned to work with that. And the other one is heartbreak. Man, that's a tough one. Heartbreak is tough. When a person's heart's broken, it appears to be, to the outside observer, oh, it's nothing, get over it, find somebody else, to the outside observer. But to the person suffering from heartbreak, it's like, there is no future for me. What are you talking about? I'm dead. It's like, it feels bad when the heart's broken. So working with that is it takes a whole different set of skills. And the way I learned about heartbreak was in my second divorce. It was like, dude, I don't know what happened to me. I wasn't like this before. I became nothing, like something bad is happening here. So I went to about 12 therapists and I couldn't get any help. Everybody wanted to treat me for anxiety and depression, which were certainly a part of the problem, but there were side effects of a much bigger...
They were consequences, not causes.
Consequences, yeah. It's like it wasn't quite the issue there. And so I realized, dude, I'm alone in this. I have to figure this out. So then I remembered that I had worked in the past with people in heartbreak, and I had a few simple notes that I had written down. I started looking them up, and I wanted to help myself. Let me remember how I would deal with somebody like this in the office, years ago. And as I started reading those notes, I go, maybe I can put this together in a different way, and maybe I can help other people, whatever. Next thing you know, that became my first book, Awesome Again, which became an Amazon bestseller. And I'm so proud of that book because I wrote it in 27 days at a time when I couldn't even sleep. I was hurting so bad. But it goes to show you what, in my opinion, is the power of God. I think that, as a hypnotist, people ask me, well, do you believe in God? I don't know. As a hypnotist, I don't know. As a man, I'm a complete believer. I'm a pastor, I told you. And I think that we all receive help. And I couldn't have made it without God, I don't think. So during those years that were really difficult, I think what kept me going was this extra help that is difficult to define, but that I call God, and that really made it possible to keep on going. And here we are.
I have, we're running near our time here, and but I do have something that a single adult relational. I was a single adult minister for nearly a decade, so I spent a lot of time with single adults when I was young, when I was in my 30s and early 40s. And I see it now with my wife, and I have friends that are like Martha, that are gorgeous, that are wonderful to be with, that are successful, blah, 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 blah. But they keep choosing, pardon the expression, they keep choosing assholes. They keep choosing these men that are not helpful. And what is it that, you talked about patterns and, relationship patterns that we develop, and we have to break them. What is it that drives a woman to be attracted to a man that is not going to please her?
Well, great question, but I just want to say that it also happens to men. It doesn't just happen to women. Men also get into a fixed pattern where they choose women. And I don't think anybody is a bad person. I think we're all God's children. That's my personal opinion. So I don't think anybody is a bad person, but I do think that some people...
you'd rather not spend time with, though.
Right. Well, some people are really not the right fit for us. Right.
Yeah.
And to me, it's a matter of fit, not so much a matter of this person is bad. I'm no one to say.
That's right. I get you were right. I understand.
I just want to say it that way because the way I think of it is in terms of fit. It either fits or it doesn't fit. So men also choose women who are a complete, just very destructive, and women do the same thing. So Freud, the great Sigmund Freud, who started this movement called psychoanalysis about 100 years ago or so, he called this the compulsion to repeat, which in psychoanalysis has a whole explanation, but one very, very simple simplification I know it's redundant, but a simplification of the compulsion to repeat phenomenon is addiction. What is an addiction? It's a compulsion to repeat the same behavior that is not serving us well. So a person repeats a behavior that does not work for them, that generates negative consequences. That's the compulsion to repeat. And why do we do that? We do that because there is an imprint. There's a message that's in there within us that basically says one of several things. As an example, the women that you may be referring to as an example. I don't even know these ladies. I'm just giving you an example.
Sure.
If the person has an idea stored in their unconscious mind that they don't deserve love, let's say, then they will find people who do not give them love. And that's when we, from the outside, look at it and say, oh, this guy's an asshole, the way you characterized it. That's our interpretation of it, but it's simply a person incapable of giving her love because actually, it is her own projection of her needs. She might be saying, I don't deserve love. Therefore, I need to find somebody who cannot give it to me. And the same thing happens to a man. A man might be saying, I only like women who are promiscuous. They're sexually attractive to me when they're promiscuous and they dress like in a very provocative way. He might be sexually attracted to that idea, but once they get into a relationship, they fight all the time because she's always dressed in a skimpy clothing and this and that, flirting with other guys, whatever. So they have a miserable time until they finally break up. But the question is, why is he with that person, right? Again, not that the person is bad for doing that. It's just that they're not a good fit. Another person may not care, but this guy cares, but he's with her. So we have patterns installed, ideas, concepts, imprints, tattoos. Sometimes I use the word installed in our subconscious mind. And that typically happens very early in childhood. We don't remember it, hence the idea of the unconscious, but we're basically repeating the ideas that are consistent with what's stored in our unconscious minds. Some people just don't believe they deserve to be happy until we change that.
Yeah, I like, I even put it in the title of the show, why we repeat patterns until we wake up.
Yeah.
I think that's brilliantly said. You have a way with words. So is this related, and this will be my last question, is the not deserving of love with a woman, is that largely father related and with a man largely mother related, or is that non-gender or non-relation, parental relationship?
Yeah, it's a great question. About 100 years ago when psychoanalysis started, this idea of the cross-gender parent, the boy with the mom, all of those ideas were very prominent. Oedipus and Electra, these ideas were quite prominent in psychoanalysis. And I think that that's a good it's a good starting point, right? So if a man comes to see me and he has problems with women, we would start off asking about his relationship with his mother. That's a good beginning of the conversation, but it goes way deeper than that. And the reason nowadays why it goes way deeper than that is because everybody already knows that. Therefore, this person typically, by the time they come to see me, they've already seen 2,000 videos on YouTube about the mother complex and Electra and Oedipus. And in other words, they've already sorted some of these things out, and they've already removed a few layers of the unconscious. Right? So there are deeper issues there. But I do think that the cross-gender parent is a good place to begin the conversation. Nowadays, I think oftentimes we always have to go into the unconscious. Even if the problem is with the mother or the father, we always have to go into the unconscious. The biggest mistake, if I may say this as a closing, the biggest mistake a hypnotist can make is to believe that he or she knows what the problem is. We don't. The only one who does know what the problem is the person's unconscious. The moment you think you know, you contaminate the process with your own ideas. So the critical skill for the hypnotherapist is to maintain his or her mind completely neutral in terms of my beliefs of what is better for this person or what's wrong with this person. The moment I put my beliefs in, I contaminate the process.
Precisely.
Yeah, the only one who knows is the person's unconscious. So if I start off with the notion that maybe the problem is his mom, I'm already contaminating.
Yes, that's brilliant. I am seeing, and it's a conversation I wanted to have. We may need to have a round two at some point. It's because you are I don't know if Christian mystic is right. I'm a Christian mystic, but I'm very open to any input. It doesn't have to be, from Christianity. I mean, I know you study the Kabbalah. I think it's incredible wealth of information, but you're talking like a mystic right now. You're talking like the great unknown book, the cloud of unknowing. And that as soon as we try to put our knowns into the unknowing, we have contaminated the result. It is a matter of, St. John of the Cross wrote largely much about this stuff, about being open, not being attached, about challenging our attachments and working on detaching from those elements that prevent us from living a fulfilled life.
And that idea is so true that it makes its way into modern physics and quantum physics in the form of the uncertainty principle. When you're trying to measure the position and momentum of a subatomic particle simultaneously, you can't, because the very act of measuring it displaces it or moves it or jerks it around. So then I cannot measure if I'm changing what I'm measuring at the same time. So the uncertainty principle, I think, is the same thing. And so we see that all over the place. And mystics were talking about this thousands of years ago. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, this has been a fun conversation. I'm going to add to the show notes how to find your person and Awesome Again. I will add those, so people can click right onto Amazon and get those. I'll add those in the show notes. And Flavio Souza-Campos, thank you so much for spending time with me. I am honored that you would take the time to do this. You're a wonderful guest.
Charlie, the honor is all mine. Thank you so much. I admire you greatly, and thank you so much for this opportunity. And I'm also looking for an opportunity for round two, and I'm looking forward to getting to know you better. Thank you so much.
Thank you. And I want to thank everybody for tuning in to the next chapter with Charlie. And until next, this is Charlie Hedges signing off. Bye for now.